Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm here with Laura Purcell to talk about our latest book, The Shape of Darkness. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. If we could open up by you describing the plot of your new book, please, which came out in January the 21st in the UK.
Yeah, of course. So, The Shape of Darkness is set in Victorian Bath. It's about a silhouette artist whose clients start to die in mysterious ways. The police can't solve the murders, so she consults a spirit medium, hoping to make contact with the dead and find out what happened to them. But she starts to find, as she holds more and more seances, that she might have unleashed something she can't put back.
I love the horror genre because of how it manages to bridge um, crime as well. Um,
Yeah.
when I saw you at, I think it was Spookfest, you were on a panel with CJ Tudor and talking about short stories, and
Oh, yeah, that's right.
yeah, I just read your Audible original this morning.
Oh, thank you.
What was it like creating one for audio exclusively?
It was a really different process, actually. It's strange when you're an author because you write novels and people kind of assume that you can also write short stories, that you can write articles and reviews and all kinds of things. Um, and I hadn't had a lot of short story experience. All my experience had been for novels. So that Welcome Collection Audible original short story was a really fun project to work on. Something really different for me, um, and it was great to go along to the Welcome Trust and see all the objects that they had. We got to each choose an object and base our story around one of the objects in the collection. So that was just a lovely thing, being able to go there and see all the amazing sort of macabre artifacts they had. Um, but when I knew I was writing something for audio and it was solely going to be in audio, it was a much more important to me that my character had a voice. I think she ends up with slightly a sort of servant, common Cockney accent. Um, but it was important to me that it would be in first person narration, just because I wanted to give the narrator something to work with, something that was easy to say, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When you were working on the narration for your new one, because narrators are, I'd say, the most crucial part of your books because
Yeah.
they tell the story from different angles. What made you decide on the narration for the your new one, The Shape of Darkness? Because of course that one was from two different angles.
Yes. I tend to choose to have more than one narrator in most of my books. I don't know if that's just because I get bored with one voice or whether I like to see things from different angles. And I think a lot of my work, dwells upon something that could be seen one way or could be seen the other. So I like to have two different viewpoints, and that often shows itself as two different narrators. Um, for The Shape of Darkness, I had fun with rather different narrators because although it's not first person, you see something from Agnes's point of view, and she's a silhouette artist. She's in her late 40s. She's a very kind of repressed, staid personality. And then the other character whose point of view you get is a 11-year-old girl called Pearl. Um, and she's not as well brought up as Agnes. She's lived a very sheltered life. So they really had different voices to play with. So that was a nice way to break up the book for me when I was writing. I thought, right, whose head am I in now? And I could tell quite clearly between the two.
They're very different with them having, as you said, one in your mid 40s and one at age 11. That must have been
Yeah.
a challenge getting your head around which voices and the style.
Yeah, I think somehow it does help a bit when there is that extreme, the difference between them. If you've got two people that are a similar kind of age, a similar kind of background, you can forget which one you're writing as and maybe slip more easily one into the other. Whereas I think with Agnes and Pearl, it was good for me because I had very distinct settings and characters.
Yeah, you did do that in a similar way in Bone China when you went back 40 years with one of the earlier characters. So.
Yeah, that's right. Bone China, the structure of that was quite different. It's kind of broken into pieces, and I struggled quite a lot to pin that structure down, because it goes back and forward in time in sort of chunks, and like you say, the narrators are they're linked, but they're different. They're both nurses or involved in the medical profession, but their personalities are quite different.
What is it about the medical profession in your writing that you're so comfortable about writing in?
I think it's because when the first book that I had published was published by a small publisher, and it was about Queen Charlotte, the wife of George III. So I did a lot of research into medicine, and particularly sort of psychiatric medicine. It wasn't called that at the time, but because George III famously went mad, I had to cover a lot of his life and a lot of the medical tortures really that happened to him. And I was just so struck with, how archaic and quite barbaric many of these medical treatments were. I think it made me interested to follow that throughout history and see how much better and worse things alternatively became. Because as is shown in The Shape of Darkness, there were some really horrific diseases in the Victorian era that can't be treated, and it's it makes you very, very thankful for modern medicine.
Yeah, I did find myself rather thankful that as I was reading Shape of Darkness, that I wasn't actually looking at a visualization of fuzzy jaw, because it's not.
Yeah. No,
It's not the
really
nicest.
grim. I mean, really grim. And you think about it now. So what happened was Pearl's father worked in a match factory, and matches were made with phosphorus, and so the phosphorus just sort of ate through his jaw. And there's a lot of documentation about this really happening to match girls, and it sounds really horrific. They had to have their whole jawbones removed. You think, now we know that phosphorus can be poisonous, but back then it was just, either ignored or just, they didn't have health and safety in HR. They just had to keep working through these horrific conditions, no matter what it did to their body.
You also used a stroke as one of your angles in Bone China.
Oh, yeah.
I know that the medical side of it is something that you seem to have covered, but what was it like doing it for different ages? Because your stroke character was elderly in the Bone China.
Yeah, it's I mean, it varies across the ages as well, because with Bone China, that was set mainly, well, it kind of went between the 1770s and 1812, and where The Shape of Darkness is set in 1854. So obviously there were big leaps in medicine over those sort of 50 years. But how people were affected was very much the same, the same as it is today. Though the treatments weren't as good, a lot of the symptoms were the same, so it became a bit easier to write about. But yeah, with Louisa in Bone China, who had the stroke, I really enjoyed writing about an older character. I liked having the chance to show her as a young woman and as an older woman, because that's something I'm always interested in with my books. When I write the end and I say goodbye to some characters, sometimes I think, oh, what would they be like 20 years down the line? What would happen to them? It was nice to be able to answer that in Bone China.
When you decide on the narrators, I mean, it seems to be crucial for you because they tell the story from their own perspective. But
Mm.
what does that interaction like with other characters that you put to help tell their story?
Yeah, I think it's seeing a character through different eyes. So you know how the character views themselves as how you view them as the author, but then how other characters view them. Um, and for example, with Agnes in The Shape of Darkness, she knows other people view her as a little bit strange, but obviously she doesn't think she's strange. And then later in the book, when you see her through the eyes of Pearl, a young girl, she seems, very different. She seems almost creepy, with her, jittery ways and her old-fashioned clothes.
The problem that she got with cataract seemed a bit unusual considering that she's only in her 40s. Was that down to the historical period in her job?
Yeah, I thought about the sort of eye strain that she would have been under, taking silhouettes all the time, and I think I just wanted as well to give the reader a way to sort of question what she was seeing. That little bit of ambiguity where you think, okay, has she seen that, or is because her vision's not perfect, is she thinking she's seen something she hasn't? But yeah, poor Agnes does have quite a lot of health difficulties, but she's not been very lucky with her health. She was involved in an accident, which remains mysterious throughout most of the book. And then she had a nasty bout of pneumonia that nearly took her life. So yeah, she's suffering through quite a few ailments.
When you were doing your first Gothic book, you had looked into phrenology, and of course, that is a very unique way of deciding whether someone's has got criminal attributes. Why
Mm.
did you decide on phrenology as an angle for your book?
So that came about quite organically, actually. In the corset, my character Dorothea is interested in phrenology, and she visits prisons to study people's skulls because she wants to prove the phrenological theory that the bumps on someone's skull will determine whether they're a criminal or whether they're a good person. Um, Originally, when I came up with the story idea, Dorothea was actually quite a small character. She wasn't, a dual narrator as she ended up being. But when I decided that I wanted her in the story from the beginning, and I wanted to give her an interest and a reason to be going to the prison so often. Um, and when I sort of thought, well, what are the weird Victorian things that I want to study more about? And when I came across phrenology, I thought that's perfect because it's creepy, because it's to do with skulls. It has that lovely kind of macabre quality in it. But it also relates to their theory of what causes people to commit crimes. So it also gives her an excuse to go to the prison. So yeah, it just grew from there, really.
Silhouettes as a background then must have been a bit mild compared to that.
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. But I first had the idea to use silhouettes when I went to a festival in Bath. It was the Jane Austen Festival, and I attended a silhouette workshop there. And we got a lovely history of the art form and a demonstration of how they were cut. And just seeing the silhouettes made me think, ooh, they're kind of a faceless, shadowy thing. They could be quite an interesting motif for a book. So that's when I started thinking about them.
On Twitter at the moment, you've got a silhouette of yourself or what appears
Yes.
to be. How did you come across that? Was it like a program that was to do that for you, or?
No, I had it cut. So the man whose workshop I went to when I was in Bath was called Charles Burns, and he's a very talented silhouette artist. And his talk was so helpful. I later got his book to help me understand how Agnes managed to make silhouettes. So during the lockdown, Charles Burns was doing virtual silhouette appointments through his website. So I was feeling bored and I wanted to treat myself. So I contacted him and he cut my silhouette over Zoom, which was, amazing. So talented to be able to do that. But it was a really fun process.
Yeah, because they can tell. Anyone that's seen you pictures could tell it's you on the silhouette. So.
Yeah, he's very good at getting a likeness. And I saw him work when I was at the Jane Austen Festival, and it is just amazing to see how quickly he can do it. When we went to the silhouette workshop with him, he gave us some paper and stuff to practice with to try and make our own. And he is so hard just seeing the results of the ones that we made that we spent so long on and was so awful. And then you see him cut one freehand within a minute. It's just incredible.
Before we came on, you said that you write about one book a year. So how long, when you were at Bath, how long after Bath did you put pen to paper and start the idea for Shape of Darkness?
That's a good question, because I think it kind of sat in my head for quite a while. I had an idea that I wanted to write it, and I was in Bath in 2016, the autumn of 2016. And I knew that I wanted to write it, but then another book came out that involved silhouettes, and I didn't want it to be too close to that. And I was already contracted to write The Corset after The Silent Companions. And I wanted the silhouette one to be one of my next books, but I didn't want it coming out too close towards this other silhouette book I'd found out about. So I wrote Bone China first. So I guess I'm trying to think when I ended up putting pen to paper. I probably started writing it about 2018. Yeah, so maybe it's a good 2 years, I'd say, between having the idea and actually starting to write it.
Given that it was that long between putting pen to paper and getting it published, you must have loads of ideas in the back of your mind. How do you decide what the next one is when you've got that many?
Yeah, it's difficult. And sometimes there's ideas that you have that you quite like, that you run past your agent and your publisher, and they're not as keen on, they don't think it will work. So you have to scrap that and come up with something new. So yeah, it is very difficult trying to decide which idea is going to be a winner. It's mainly getting the advice, I think, of my editor and my agent, and also thinking about what excites me the most, because you end up reading your own book so many times. So many times. I think I probably end up reading, my own book about 15 times at least, after the first draft is completed before publication. So you've got to try and choose something that you're not going to get bored of, because even if you start off loving something, by the end of it, you are getting a bit sick of it.
What is it about ghosts and ghouls? Because it's one of my favourite angles for stories. Because it was in Chris Brookmeyer's Rubber Ducks book that I first came across the idea of the crime angle, and it's very complex to decide about ghosts and things and how they're seen by the people that practice it.
Yeah. I guess I kind of ended up falling into writing about ghosts in a way, because I have always loved horror stories, and sort of, horror movies. But really, I ended up going into it when I wrote The Silent Companions, which was just an idea I had. I saw the real life Silent Companions, which are wooden figures, sort of like a fireboard painted to look like people. And they creeped me out so much, I decided, I'm going to write a scary story. but that was kind of where it stopped in my head. I thought I will write one scary story and it'll be a good scary story, and then I'll write something else. But actually, because that took off, people wanted more ghostly stories from me. So I thought, oh, I'm going to have to delve a bit deeper into this and come up with some more ghostly ideas. And yeah, I think the more ghost stories I read, the more I talk to people about it, the more interested I become. I can't say I really believe in ghosts myself, but I find the stories and people's experiences really fascinating.
Yeah, because in Rubber Ducks, it was about trying to disprove mystics and things.
Oh,
I
I
know
haven't
that I
read
know
it.
that yeah, I know that your book is more about how it's done to help people and like through Pearl. But what were the technical things you found that's difficult about doing the research for that?
I think, I mean, I loved researching these seances in the Victorian era. It was, it was so much fun to research them because you came across so many different people. You came across people that did seem very fraudulent, and were in it to make a quick buck. Um, and you also came across people. So I was studying one family called the Theobalds, who had lost a lot of children. They had 11 children and only 4 survived. And seeing them experiment with spiritualism was actually quite a nice thing to research. I could see, how it was a big comfort to them and it was actually quite healing to them. So that was an element of research that I hadn't really expected. And then seeing some other people, I studied a lady called Elizabeth d'Esperance, who believed she was a spirit medium, and she had some very scary experiences throughout her life, and she felt at times that she was going mad. So that was quite a difficult read in a way because you really felt for this person who was seeing these things and feeling so afraid. And you start to speculate yourself. You think, well, was she mentally unwell? Was she really seeing these things? What actually happened? So digging through all that, I think, was a bit difficult to try and decide, what was really going on, because obviously I'll never know what really happened to these people. So you have to make your own conclusions, really.
Yeah, because it was such a big thing in that period, with Conan Doyle being one of its
Yeah.
major backers of the idea.
Yeah, he was. And I think, it's very interesting to consider that era because so many new things were being discovered all the time. Um, it must have seemed quite possible that you could contact the dead because things that people had never imagined would happen were happening. Things like photographs and being able to travel on the railway, and being able to send a message through telegraph wires. These were all things that seemed like magic to them, and they they were happening all the time now. So I guess the idea that we found a way to communicate with the dead seemed quite plausible.
Is it um, the the period or the the science that you managed to stick to? Because in both books that I've read of yours so far, you've got a background of something particularly big for that period, and you seem to go really well into it without having to, without seeming like it's not as if you're preaching it to people. There's a background to the story, so it must be difficult to get right.
Yeah, I think, I like to get a balance. I'm very open-minded myself, and I don't like to condemn anyone's beliefs. So I like to have this kind of balance in my characters, where there'll be one person believing one thing, one person believing another. And you as a reader kind of have to decide between them for yourself.
When uh, when you were growing up as a reader, who did you read, and who do you think helped develop your style?
Oh, I did loads of reading growing up. and I was really fond of. I think as a child, I was really fond of books about dogs and horses. You know, I loved Black Beauty and I loved Lassie. But then as I got to a teenager, I became really interested in the classics, and I read a lot of Bronte, a lot of Dickens, and a lot of Jane Austen. And I think Jane Austen was the most influential in forming me as a writer, because yeah, I just love her. I can't get enough of her books. So she was a really big influence on me. And then I started getting into people, sort of historical novelists like Philippa Gregory and Elizabeth Chadwick. And they formed a big part of my sort of reading education. And then onto, you know, some horror authors like Shirley Jackson and Stephen King. So I think it's a blend of all these different genres and people you see in my books, because I don't really stick to one genre.
It's definitely a blend, I would say, because in China there's not much crime. So, what made you decide to go and do murders so graphically in Shape of Darkness? Because there are some gruesome bits in it.
Well, I think, funnily enough, when we were at this silhouette workshop I mentioned in Bath, there was a piece of equipment used to take silhouettes. It kind of had a rod on it that traced the outline of your face. It was called a physiognotrace, and my friend and I were sort of playing with one, and she joked to me that it could be a good murder weapon because it, you know, you could stick the pole through someone's eye. It was really quite dangerous. So I guess that had, you know, a link between silhouettes and murder in my mind. But I also think because I write for an imprint which does a lot of crime, I think I was, you know, indirectly influenced by everything I was reading. I was getting to read a lot of proof copies of other authors coming out from my publisher, and I was reading, you know, a lot of crime and murder mystery books. And I thought, oh, it would be interesting to do a spooky angle on one of these.
When you were doing the in China, that was about fairies as a background. That's very different. What made you look at fairies? Because I love the idea of that. And it's not that I was looking for the crime, because I don't always think that sometimes you need a break from it. So it was really nice to do that. What was it about fairies for you?
Fairies have always fascinated me, actually. The idea of fairies and just the rich fairy lore, all these different kinds of fairies. I started collecting model fairies as a child, and just finding out all, you know, the stories, things even down to, like you were saying about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He believed in the Cottingley fairies photos. It's just always really fascinated me as an idea. And I think with Bone China, I knew I wanted to set it in Cornwall. And you know, when you think what supernatural elements can you link to Cornwall, you know, fairies and folklore is the big one. So I thought, well, let's have a go. That's another aspect that I can play with of the supernatural that isn't, you know, just ghosts.
What is it about the supernatural that you've become so comfortable with? Because you've been on lots of horror panels now.
Yeah, well, I think when I set out to write the Silent Companions, and I had the idea for the Silent Companions, I wanted to write a horror novel, and it possibly ended up becoming, when I worked on it with my agent and my editor, becoming less of a pure horror novel. It became more gothic, a bit less bloody, a bit less gruesome. But when I conceived it originally in my mind, I set out to write a horror novel. So I just read so many horror novels. I absolutely filled my mind with it. So yeah, I think that's why I've then gone back on some of these supernatural ideas in later works, because I just had a glut of supernatural literature to read. But yeah, I've always been a fan of the genre. I think what I enjoy about horror is that film is such a big part of it as well. You know, it's not just the literature; it goes across film and, you know, TV, And it's a really nice it sounds bizarre, but it's a really nice community, the horror community, when you meet horror fans at things. Although they're interested in lots of gory, horrible things, they're genuinely lovely people.
When you're doing these online panels, you were um, mainly talking about short stories. We were on about short stories earlier. What is it about the short story format that leads well towards horror? Do you think?
Yeah, we you and I spoke about the short stories in After Sundown, which was a collection through Flame Tree Press that I was in a panel on with CJ Tudor and some other brilliant authors who I've forgotten. But yeah, we were talking about short stories because for horror they are so effective because I think sometimes when you're trying to stretch an idea into a novel, it loses some of its impact. Like a horror can be a very spooky scene, you know, and a short, sharp shock. Whereas when you have to stretch it into 80,000 to 100,000 words, um, it can lose some of that tension. You know, you can't have a novel that is 100% tense all the way through because the reader will get fatigue of it. Whereas in a short story, I think it's a lot easier to build a kind of creepy scene, set up a creepy idea, and then just leave the reader with it. I think it works really well, as shown by M.R. James and Daphne du Maurier wrote some great semi-horrific short stories as well. Yeah, I think it works very well in that format.
um, with the short story thing, I think that might help you with your splitting of the characters because from the books I've read of yours so far, you seem to write stories within stories. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's interesting actually. You're right, I do, and I hadn't really thought about that before. Um, I guess I think the thing is it's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Everything you start to explore, you find another story. Um, Whenever I start to look at a character, I think, well, okay, what happened in their past life? And then you start to think, oh, okay, but what happened to that person that they were friends with then? And you start to you start to explore more. But I think really it comes from my fascination with people's stories. You know, I'm interested in the backstory of everybody I meet, everybody I talk to, and um, I think in forming characters, it's essential to think of the struggles that someone's been through in the past and what's made them the character they are today.
When combining those uh, different parts, what's the editing process been like with your editor? Because obviously, if they're seeing disparate stories, it must have been easier to work on it when you got someone to advise you on that situation.
Yeah, yeah, it does help. And you know, I've had a novel recently that I've been trying to write, and I just had to send it to my agent and just say, "What, what am I writing? Can you help me decide, you know, which bits of this I should focus on and pull out because it's a bit all over the place at the moment." And yeah, it really it hugely helps having other perspective on it. You know, sometimes it can be annoying because they'll point out something and it'll be 100% right, but you've got to do so much work to put it right that you think, oh, I wish I'd never asked. But yeah, it's there's always a lot going on in my mind during the editing process. I'm always trying to work out how I can fix things. You know, I'll often get an editorial letter back from my editor that will tell me what isn't working and saying, you know, can we find some way to do it a bit like this? And I have to sit with it for a few weeks, and I'm always, you know, in the shower cooking dinner in the background in my head going, oh, there must be a way. How do I fix this? How do I change this bit of the plot? um, but yeah, it definitely helps having someone to talk to about it so you don't feel like you're going mad.
Your books seem to be very popular in America. Do, do they have different advice and ideas about how things might go, or is it?
To be honest, I haven't worked too closely with the editorial process in America. They tend to sort of take the edits that I've done with my British publisher and just sort of tweak and change. The one that I had the most editorial feedback from America was with Bone China, where there were some additional scenes that my editor thought actually didn't really need to be there and could be cut to make it slicker. And yeah, it was actually quite useful working on it again with her and seeing it in a different way. So the two versions of Bone China and The House of Whispers, it's called in America, they're slightly different books because of it. But yeah, I think, it's great to have as much feedback as you can. And right, the only problem is if you've got two editors and one thinks one thing and one thinks another, you don't know which one to side with. But thankfully, I haven't really had that.
With the American market giving you different names for your books, what is it like coming up with a different name after you've maybe released it in the UK first?
Yeah, it's quite difficult actually. I was relieved with The Shape of Darkness that they were happy with that and they wanted to keep that title, because once you've thought of a book as something for a long time, I mean, thinking up a title is always difficult, thinking up, the first title. And when you've finally done it, and then they say, no, but we want to call it something else, it's very difficult because in your head, it will always be called what you first named it. But it was quite fun having a bit of a brainstorm with my American editor and with my agent. They'd suggest some things and I'd say, well, I don't like them, but I like that word. Maybe I can do something with that word. And then I'd suggest some things and they'd come back. And between us, we'd kind of craft together a title that we were all happy with. It was quite a good collaborative process.
As my audience will know, I generally listen to it on audio, but what's your experiences with the audiobook been like? I know you've not read this one yet because we were discussing it before, but what about your earlier ones?
Yeah, I've read. I mean, it's such a strange thing because I also love audiobooks, and I was so excited that my work was being made into audiobooks. But it's very difficult to listen to as an author, hearing your own words, because you cringe a little bit, and it's also because the voice inside your head that you're so used to hearing when you're reading it again and again is obviously going to be different to the voice of who's narrating it, and there can be a bit of a disconnect where it feels a bit surreal because it's hearing another voice say your words. But the ones that I've listened to, I've been really happy with. I've really enjoyed. I think Natalie Buscombe did an excellent job with The Corset, and I've listened to some of that. And I've forgotten the lady's name that narrated Bone China, but she was excellent. I was so pleased with that because there were some scenes in Bone China that I hadn't been that fond of, and then I heard her narrate and I really liked them, and I thought, this is amazing. She's made it better. And with The Shape of Darkness, my husband played me the seance scene the other day, and that was so brilliantly done, because I did feel a bit guilty when I wrote The Shape of Darkness because I knew it was going to be difficult for the narrator because there are quite a few different voices in it and there's singing. And I thought, oh, I wouldn't want to be the narrator. But actually, when I listened to it, she did a brilliant job. And the singing was really creepy in the seance scenes. And I thought, this is brilliant. This is perfect. So, yeah, I have to say, I've been impressed with all of them.
Yeah, the singing was a really unique element of the audiobook because you could tell she was actually singing.
Yeah, she's got such a lovely singing voice as well. I thought this is very, very talented. I mean, they've all been brilliant. But my husband listens to the audiobooks. He doesn't read physical books. He just listens to audiobooks, and he's full of praise for the narrators. And I think he thinks that The Shape of Darkness is the best narrated one so far.
Well, I think that yeah, I'd agree with that actually. I think that narration is a key part of the books. And as we were saying, because of your style, if you were to be able to choose somebody to act, like if it was on TV, do you think that would change things? Because your description is very detailed, and yeah, I think it
Yeah,
might take something away from it a bit
yeah,
if it was on
possibly.
screen.
I
Yeah.
think it's difficult with narrators because when I sort of think, oh, who would I ideally want to narrate my books? I don't think that I know enough narrators and I have it in my head. I think whoever they end up picking, always I listen to it and I think, yes, that's perfect. But I don't think I could have picked them myself. And yeah, if it was on TV, oh, I don't know. I like discovering, hidden gems, and I think I found that with audio narrators as well. You come across people that you think, oh, I haven't heard anything narrated by them before, but they're brilliant. And I think it would be the same if you were going to see a character portrayed on screen, maybe someone that you hadn't heard of before, but came through.
Yeah, because that's what I really like about the historical period stuff. You get to really feel like you're there. What um, do you find helps you describe the period with it being so different to now?
Yeah, I read a lot. I read a lot of fiction set in the eras that I write in. I try and immerse myself in that era as much as I can. So I'll read a lot of non-fiction history about the times, about everyday life. I'll read a lot of fiction that also brings in some other elements, and I'll try and see pictures from the time. I'll try and watch movie and TV set in the time, listen to music from the time, and just try and immerse myself in it as much as I can so that it becomes sort of second nature to describe, a Victorian street. I'll have a lot of things ready to hand. But I think, creating period is another way of creating atmosphere, really. And I really enjoy creating atmosphere. So it's quite a nice thing to research and try and add more little details. The only problem can be with you sometimes don't know everything and you have to leave. Sometimes I'll leave a little bit in my writing to myself to say, research what would have been on this street, or research how they would have done this, because you don't always have the answers at your fingertips, but it comes later.
What was what was it about Bath that made it such an interesting place for the Shape of Darkness to be based in? I know there's a lot about the baths and the waters and stuff.
Yeah,
I don't
I've been
really know much
obsessed
else.
with Bath for a long time. I think because I said to you, I'm such a Jane Austen fan, and she lived in Bath for a long period. Um, and she also set two of her novels in Bath. So I've always loved Bath and been really interested in the Georgian history of it. It's Georgian heyday, and it's such a beautiful place now. What I wanted to do with it in The Shape of Darkness is explore the time in its history when it wasn't so beautiful, when it had kind of fallen from favour with all the fashionable people in the Georgian era, and it was getting to be a little bit down a hill. It wasn't the beautiful World Heritage Site that it is now. It was in a kind of Gothic state, to be honest, decayed former glory. So it lent itself really well, and it gave me an excuse to use all my knowledge about Bath that I had accumulated during the Jane Austen study.
We seem to have got a couple of audience questions. I don't know whether you can see them, but if you can't, I just have to give
Oh,
us a.
fantastic. Oh, one said, what has surprised you most during research for The Shape of Darkness? I think some of the things that surprised me were regarding the spirit mediums and the research, because some of it was actually quite violent. I found out there was this one spirit medium called Mrs. Guppy, and she was quite mischievous, and she used to have these things that she called apports that came from the ceiling. So there'd be like gifts from the spirits, you know, they'd start off as something like petals or something pretty falling down. But she gradually built it up and up, um, to the point where she had live lobsters falling from the ceiling onto people. One of her friends never forgave her because she made tar fall from the ceiling onto her. And she was in competition with another medium. And she actually, my friend told me that she actually considered having acid thrown onto this other medium from the ceiling. She didn't go through with it at the end, thank goodness. But it really shocked me that the competitiveness could get to those levels where, you know, people are throwing tar and acid at each other and saying, oh, it's the spirits. And then there was another spirit medium called Rosina Showers. And she was trying to prove to people that she could make a ghost appear while she was in a cabinet. And she was trying to prove to people that, you know, she stayed in that cabinet and what was appearing was not her in costume, it was a ghost. And so the way she did this was that she had her earlobe sewn to the curtain in the cabinet to kind of prove that she'd stayed there. And that was just horrified me.
Oh, wow. Oh,
So
kind of
yeah.
gruesome.
Yeah, they were a kind of a gruesome lot. And I think someone else has asked me, is there a time period that you would have liked to have lived in? To be honest, no. I mean, as you know, as a woman, I think a lot of the periods I study would have been quite horrific for me to live in. And also, as we were discussed with like modern medicine, you know, there are so many things that would have killed me by now if I'd lived in the Victorian era. My favourite era is the Regency era, the Jane Austen time. And I'd love to maybe go and visit for a weekend and maybe go to a Regency ball, but I really wouldn't want to live there. I'm very comfortable with my modern lifestyle, my Starbucks.
We were talking about the audio exclusive for Audible at the beginning, and you were on about diseases and stuff. That
Mm.
was the key for that plot as well.
Yeah, there was a sort of a syphilis subplot involved there. Again, you know, something else that's really horrific about history if you study it, you know, the effects of sexually transmitted diseases upon people. And they had special hospitals called the lock hospitals, to house people who were suffering from this. But, you know, syphilis was one of the most awful ones. And, you know, people lost their noses. It was, it's gruesome. It's really gruesome. You know, a lot of the gruesome things in my book, I really don't need to make up. You know, history itself is quite frightening.
If you were to write and like modern, because you said you struggled to cope, would you do that, or you quite comfortable doing just historical stuff?
I don't, you know, I'm very open. I never say never. And I would quite like to write something modern, but I don't know. I don't know how I'd come up with an idea for it. I feel like I'm very safe in my rut, and I know a lot more about historical life than I do about modern life. But you know, I would be open to it. I think I just really need a good idea, and something that could really hold my attention. But generally, you know, my imagination tends to be captured by these strange things in the past.
If you were to recommend a book that you've read recently, what would it be and why?
Ooh. Well, I'm currently reading Bird Box by Josh Malaman, I think it is. And it's a very good book. I'd seen the Netflix movie quite a while ago, but long ago enough that I'd forgotten a lot of the plot twists. And as always, the book is much richer. And I'm loving how he uses sound in it. You know, a lot of the scary scenes, the characters can't see anything; they can only hear. And the way he uses that to build the atmosphere is just amazing. But what has also really interested me is because the book is set at a time of, you know, international crisis. where people are having to stay indoors. The parallels with the pandemic were actually unexpected and very, it was strongly reminiscent of the beginning of the pandemic. And what was amazing to me was that, when it was published, which I think was 2014, he'd got all this stuff, the way people react to these things, dead on. He'd nailed it before it happened. So yeah, I've been really impressed with it.
Yeah, I was quite interested in why you chose your plot line for Bone China, because of course that was based around I think it was I'm trying to think what it is now.
Oh, tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis. Why was that? Because that was
Yeah, that ended up being quite bad for me in a way, because when the paperback was coming out last April was just when the pandemic took off, and I thought, oh God, no one is going to want to read a book about people dying from breathing difficulties at this time. But I think it was something that really captured, the Victorian and Georgian imagination, tuberculosis, and in their fiction and in their minds, it had this strong sort of supernatural link. They kind of had this idea that people, delicate people, declined and died of tuberculosis, and then there's also kind of a link in some cultures in the imagination between vampirism and tuberculosis. So it was just really interesting as a disease. And I'd come across, I knew when I wrote Bone China, before I came up with the general idea of it, that I wanted to write something set in a creepy cave. And I found out about a Victorian era doctor in America who took people with tuberculosis to live in a cave because he thought the air would help them. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. That's such a bizarre thing to do, to take, terminally sick people to live in a cave. So I incorporated that story and I moved it to Cornwall. So it's kind of an English version of that.
So with 10 minutes left, I was just thinking, we were talking about how far you plan in advance. So could you tell us what's next?
I'm struggling quite a lot with my next book. I think the pandemic has kind of short-circuited my brain a little bit. I'm hopefully back on track a bit now, but the idea is not that clear in my head that I can do a good pitch for it at the moment. So there is more coming in a similar vein. But yeah, I'm just having to work through a few snags at the moment.
Snags are normal.
Yeah, I think that's it. And when I've suddenly thought about my output over the last few years, when I've been writing short stories and I've been writing novels. I think actually my brain probably has had a little bit of burnout from coming up with so many different things. So I've got the premise for my next book. I just I really need to get the plot honed and pinned down, because I had a lot of ideas that were kind of going off at different variants, but my agent's been helping me. So hopefully I'll be able to have some more news on that when I've written a bit more of it and I'm a bit more confident what the hook is going to be.
Yeah. No problem at all. What would you say is the hardest thing about writing short stories and long at the same time? Because you seem to be involved in quite a few anthologies as well.
Yeah. I I want to practice my short story writing. And so when I get approached to write short stories, I can very rarely resist, especially if they're horror, because with my novels, they are, strongly horror leaning, but they're kind of more for a mainstream market, more for a mainstream readership. Whereas if you're in a horror anthology, you can go full on horror. And the temptation to do that is always quite strong for me. But yeah, writing two at the same time is really difficult. But I think sometimes short stories can be good for me to have a break from the novel, because I would have been working on a novel for months and months and months. And, you get to the point in your head where you can't see the wood through the trees. So actually, sometimes to take maybe a few weeks or a month off and work on a short story works as a kind of good refresher, sort of changes as good as a rest in a way.
When you're on these panels online, what would you say you've learned from being on that and talking with other authors on those panels?
Yeah, I love talking with other authors. I quite like it. I think I said to you when not all of the attention is on me, um, because you can bounce ideas off each other, and it's actually really positive to find out that other people have similar struggles. Because I think, especially with the age of social media, there's a tendency just to focus on people's successes and to see like, wow, they've done this, they've done this. You think, they must be so confident, they must be doing so well. And actually, when you talk about the writing process, you find out that they've had similar struggles, uh, and that you're not you're not crazy. I think the problem is being an author working on your own. You tend to start to think, that it's just you that has these troubles or struggles this way. So talking to other authors is always really helpful, actually, to find out that we're all pretty much in the same boat.
Yeah, because I first came across you on Noir at the Bar and the Spook Fest.
Oh yeah, that was
Um,
great.
yeah. What made you decide on what section to read when you were doing Noir at the Bar? Because at the time, Shape of Darkness was generally new and wasn't even out yet. So
Yeah.
why did you choose that section?
I I wanted, so because it was a Halloween party, I wanted to read something spooky. Um, and I felt that generally, The Shape of Darkness was a bit spookier than some of, than Bone China maybe, or The Corset, which are both sort of supernatural, but perhaps not quite as spooky. But I always struggled to pick readings because I think it was like I was saying to you about the voice in my head. There is a voice in my head how the book should be read, but I can't recreate it. And it's hugely frustrating to me that I can't make my voice do what it does in my head. Um, and I don't like to have to do, I'm not an audiobook narrator. I don't have to do speech or, different characters talking to each other and to put on voices. So for me, it's always trying to pick something that will make sense, that will be spooky, that won't give too much away, and won't mean that I have to do any voices. So it takes quite a time to pick things.
Yeah, and the challenge of doing it so early, long before it's published, must have been hard too.
Yeah, it's good practice though. Good practice, I think. I can see some things pinged up that says a Facebook user has asked, "What is my favourite time period to write about?" My favourite time period is the Regency, but I don't write many books in it at the moment because I think I don't really associate it with creepiness and supernatural and ghosts. For me, the Regency is a bit more of a fun period. So yeah, I think to me it's maybe more a topic or an event that really captures my imagination rather than a particular period. But my favourite will always be the Regency, Georgian era.
I can see it eventually being a, but as you say, you've got to wait for the idea to come, haven't you? So
Yeah, it's it's a really strange thing how ideas end up coming up in your head. It's you never really know how they get there. There's a lot of different elements that feed in.
well, with 2 minutes left, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on tonight and letting us know about the world of Laura Purcell and your historical writing, which I've been really enjoying over the last couple few weeks. Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. And hopefully we'll be able to read more of your books in the near future. And if you'd like to come back, I'm sure we'd have you back at any time.
Oh, thanks, Alex. That'd be great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. I think